Welcome to Super NPC Radio's PlayStation 30th console launch retrospective. I am one of your hosts for this episode, Conner McCabe, and boy, do we have some fun stuff ready to go for you today. And because this is the first in our PlayStation 30th series of bonus episodes that we're going to be doing here on Super NPC Radio's Patreon, I've got a little extra housekeeping and introducing to do. In case you are walking into this thing blind, it showed up in your feed and you don't know what you're getting into, all year long here on the network, we are celebrating the PlayStation's 30th anniversary here in the United States, in the NTSC region, if you will. And we're doing that in a bunch of bonus ways. But the way you're hearing today is going to be the first of a series of 6 bonus episodes that we're releasing on Patreon, covering different aspects of the PlayStation. Today, we are covering the launch, leading up to where the PlayStation came from, how it got to where it was, and what was that initial reception like, and that boom when it first debuted in 1994/95 in different regions. We're going to have these episodes basically come out every other month. This one's going out to all patrons, so free all the way up through our venture capitalist toads. Everyone's getting this, but they're going to live at the Engineer Toad tier. So this first one's releasing, at the end of February. So it'll basically be a February, April, and so on release schedule. And then at the end of the year, for anybody who's on the Patreon, free and up, we're just going to release the whole collection for free. But if you want to get those episodes as they're coming out, that's going to be a bonus at the $10 Engineer Toad tier. So that's where you're going to be able to get this content. We're also doing some other free PlayStation 1 30th content throughout the year. If you're listening to this the week it comes out, we also just did a PlayStation 1 Space Solace, our fantasy draft meets Desert Island scenario in space, where we drafted our favorite PlayStation 1 games for the second time. This is a redux, the second time we've redone a console. That's free. We've got a bunch of streams going on too. I'm doing the PlayStation Library Shuffle, where almost once a month I'm getting on and spinning a wheel and seeing what random PlayStation games I have to play for 15 minutes at a time. We're also going to be doing our Rumble streams, which I don't actually think we've quite named yet, but a certain someone who's on the stream now is going to be helping us basically pit 2 newbies to PlayStation 1 games and seeing how fast each of them can speedrun through a section of it. I'm really excited for our first one next month, where Michael McCollor is going to be hosting a stream between, at the moment, Nick Costanza and Tyler Schnupp playing Resident Evil 2 against each other and seeing who can get to a certain point. I just can't wait. In the meantime, before I introduce our other panelists for today's episode, the last few things are that if you're on the Patreon, thank you so much for your support, whether you're at a free tier or a paid tier. It means so much. Share it with a friend if you know someone who's just itching for more video game content and podcasts that they don't have. Also, you can follow us all over social media at Blue Sky, Instagram, on Twitch. This is all at Super NPC Radio. And then if you're not in the Discord that we have, you did get a message when you joined Patreon with a Discord link. It's probably expired. If you want to hop in there and you're not already, DM the network on Patreon or on Instagram or whatever, and we'll be sure to send you a link to the Discord. We have 2 more panelists joining us on today's episode. So please welcome to the microphone, first and foremost, one of the, you know him, as the barely legal bastard boy of gaming. One of 2. It's Jeremy Schmidt.
Hey, Connor. It's good to be here on the PlayStation 30th.
I'm actually sorry. I introduced you as Jeremy Schmidt, but your name on Zoom clearly says Jeremy Bandicoot. That's my bad.
I'm just another one of the Bandicoots. There's Crash Bandicoot, but then there's a lot of other Bandicoots.
Jeremy Bandicoot.
And I'm Jeremy Bandicoot.
Oh, I like Mama Bandicoot.
I like Mama, yeah.
Good.
There's Mama Bandicoot, Papa Bandicoot, the 3 little pig Bandicoots.
Goldilocks is in there. She's just back. We got Jeremy here, and we're also joined to round out this crew. It's none other than Michael McCollor.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm very excited. When you guys first told me about PlayStation 30th, I was like, I got to be a part of this.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about PlayStation forever.
And here you are. I'm realizing too, something that got me a little excited in prepping for this episode is that you two, well, there's a lot of passion for this console on the network. You're going to hear from a lot of people throughout the year, and a lot of even like famous PlayStation mascots. We've already had Crash on a podcast. We had My PlayStation Classic joined for an episode recently.
Yes,
but
we did.
We have two huge PlayStation fans here, and two people who, each of your favorite games, Mike McCollor's is a tie, are games that originated on the PlayStation 1.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's correct. And we should mention, I guess, I don't know, Conner, maybe you said this. There's so many proper nouns get thrown around at the tops of these shows that sometimes I forget. But we're doing a lot of like fun, cool PlayStation 1 stuff on Video Games, a Comedy Show, which is like my podcast that airs on Mondays. You get it here if you're on the Patreon, obviously, and you probably know about it if you're on the Patreon. But, you know, on the off chance you're listening to this somewhere else, like, go back all this entire year. We're sort of honoring the PS1 as we go. But yeah, that's where you'll see kind of like the fun guests show up. But yeah, I do actually think that's interesting that like my favorite game, you know, is basically Final Fantasy VII. I mean, it's certainly the game that I say when I'm in a corner and I don't want to think about it, is I just go Final Fantasy VII. And McCollor, yours is Resident Evil 2.
Right. And similarly, like it gets confusing as there's a remake that I also love equally, but like, yeah, the PlayStation 1 is very much the console where like, gun to my head, if I had to pick one console to ever play again, it'd probably be this.
It's a good one. It's so well-rounded too.
Yeah. It's it's something that's really interesting to me about the PlayStation 1 as well is how it's starting to age in a way that that we're seeing the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis age, and that people are starting to feel a lot of nostalgia for the polygonal graphics that I'm used to thinking about them as ugly and sinful and don't ever look at them again. They're so horrible. But as time has gone on, we're seeing indie games and such get developed in this style, and people are trying to ape that feeling, that vibe that we got when we played these original polygonal games.
And it's hard to escape the shadow of the PlayStation 1.
That's true.
So at some point, yeah, there's been a bunch of games in the past few years, indie games that have, like you were getting at, that have been released. I'm thinking of Crow Country.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Mouthwashing.
Yeah.
There was that other survival horror game that McCollor, I think you and Roxy didn't like a couple years ago. I can't think of it.
Signalis.
Signalis.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anodyne, I think, is another one. Anodyne is one. I think Anodyne is a game that takes you through the history of video games in its game itself. So it like starts with like an 8-bit, and then as the story progresses, it like becomes
that's really cool.
32.
Cool idea.
Dang, you know they've got a. I know that you two are familiar with the game UFO 50, which is sort of like a fake console retrospective in the 8-bit era. It's sort of a original Nintendo style console. I want to see. It would probably be way harder to develop, but I want to see something like that for like a fake PlayStation era console.
Oh yeah, that would be incredible. I mean, if that UFO 50 team was to come back and collaborate again, I'm almost positive they would do a Super Nintendo style 16-bit thing instead, which would be a feat in and of itself. But man, can you imagine if we had like an upside down world PlayStation console?
Dude.
I do feel like those kind of teams that do retro collection games like that never go up a generation. Like there was a rumor that there was always going to be like Shovel Knight 64, and it never quite materialized.
Oh, that would be so much fun.
Yeah, we do have like that. The Celeste team did that sort of like
cool
demo.
That was
Celeste 64. Did you
cool.
both dabble with that?
I didn't play it, but I watched a playthrough of it.
I played a very little bit of it.
You guys would eat it up. I mean, because it's just so Mario 64.
Yeah,
like it's awesome. But yeah, it's a generation that we're seeing get a lot of love. I know that we all just did this in real time. This happened last night when we recorded our Space Solace episode. I was thinking it'd be fun to briefly, before we dive into the console's history and launch, to just quickly go over our histories with the console again.
Yeah, and I would like to add something to this too,
please.
just a little wrinkle to it in not just our histories, but because we all play retro games, like this particular group. Not everybody in our crew does this, but like we like to throw on the old consoles or emulate some old stuff. And so my question is, what PS1 game have you been playing lately, if any, or what was the last one that maybe you played? And then one more thing I also wanted to just throw out before we get into that is this is a weird. I'm in grad school now, so I just started grad school, and I'm gonna say of my cohort, 90% of them were not born before the PlayStation 1. They were actually not even born, a lot of them, before the PS2.
That's
so
messed up.
It's pretty messed up. I feel like this console is getting a lot of love, obviously because it's a 30th anniversary, but also because it's so linked to the 90s, and the 90s is such a commodified and like powerful decade for everybody, for Gen Z, for millennials. It
was our last safe generation, I think.
Yeah, I was hoping we could just talk briefly about like that this did take place in the 90s, and that is what is kind of special about it as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember like the 90s?
It's one of those things that I feel like this subject we've been circulating around or orbiting the subject a lot the past, especially 10 years, just with, the collapse of society and the rise of fascism. And I feel like us growing up as like, this is going to be the most 90s kid fucking thing anyone's ever said, but I feel like as 90s kids, say the word, Bart, that like the fact that because I'm also born clean 1990.
90, you're like, my wife is also born in 90 as well. Yes. McCollor and I were born 87.
Yes.
I'm 86.
Oh, you're 86? Oh, no. Why did I think? Anyway. Okay.
But still, you all like were children.
Getting cognizant.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the same with me, like kind of right around when the PlayStation even was coming out was probably when I was finally able to articulate consistent thoughts and that sort of thing. Who knows? But I think the coincidence of, me becoming 10, you guys becoming like 14 or so, around the time when we hit the new millennium and everything changed shortly after that, feels so coincidental, because I feel like at that point in anyone's age, it feels like the world changes, but ours really did in a significant way and kind of went on a different path. So anytime I think about this, it's kind of the same way that I think, wow, it's so coincidental that the first Harry Potter movie came out the day before my 11th birthday, and they're 11 in that movie. So it's for me, and the world revolves around me. It's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah, I mean, McCollor, you kind of said it was like the last safe decade. I would actually put sort of like, I would say that's definitely true. But then, slight addendum is that even after 9/11, we did have like the Obama term, which also felt like a pretty safe decade of like,
like, are we getting back on track sort of thing?
Yeah, like post-racist sort of,
yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so but I think the 90s, because there wasn't, there were wars, obviously, and there was strife and conflict going on internationally. There always is. But because it was sort of free of a lot of the baggage that we have to deal with in our modern era, concerns were allowed to be different. Like you could have, and the youth culture was like completely vibrating with like we were like spoiled brats, you know what I mean?
Yes.
We were all about fuck the system and let's skateboard and like we didn't really know what we were fighting against. We wouldn't realize until much later that we were kind of fighting against maybe nothing. There was actually nothing holding us back or down.
And I think about the things that like were really popular in the 90s. They all had this like veneer of being edgy, but
Yeah.
nothing really like professional wrestling was huge. Jerry Springer, South Park. It's all these things that like we were like lusting for conflict because there was
Yeah.
nothing going on.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue at least in the 80s they had Reagan to fight against, but in the
Mhm.
90s you have Clinton almost the whole way through, and it's
Right.
just, he's playing a saxophone and jumping in a pool on MTV. So it's like, what really is going on? And I really miss it for that. So when you watch movies of the time too, you really get the feeling that like, they're like the grunge scene is all about like, we hate our parents.
They're the worst thing to happen to us.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I'm sure for some people's true, but I
Yeah.
digress.
I do also feel like there was this it's kind of this reaction to like a cultural apathy that I noticed a lot in songs. It was like, if you want to call me baby, just go ahead now.
Hmm.
Semi-charmed kind of life.
Yeah. Very
Paula
true.
Abdul was pissed off. She's like, straight up, tell me if you want to be my lover. Like
Yeah.
like nobody was making decisions in the 90s because it was just like the economy was good. We were all just kind of kicking back. You were right. There's no major conflict that like was pulling America together to have an enemy against, and we had to just pick sides in a culture war that was just like cute. I don't know.
Hmm.
Maybe I wonder if every generation does this. They look back at like, wow, we really were worried that D&D was turning our kids into Satan worshipers. But the idea of being upset that like pro wrestlers were using middle fingers is so funny to me when
Yeah.
parents are now like, my child is sending nudes and I don't know what to do about that. Like it's
Yeah.
gotten so much worse, but also maybe it's always been getting this much worse.
Yeah, and I would also argue too that like because there was such like a low like because morality was in such like a bizarre shift of like you had like the super Christian fringe groups up against people who were like I don't know if you guys know this but like sexual thrillers in the 90s are like raunchy dudes.
Yeah.
They are like they go way harder than
When I first
movies
watched
today.
Disclosure, I had to take
Yeah.
a break.
Oh my gosh, horror films are way more violent. I mean, there's Terrifier and stuff today, but on the whole, they were taking huge swings with like sex and violence in the 90s that we ended up kind of toning down over time. And the same is kind of true with games. Like games also like you'll always have like your Dead Spaces and stuff, but they were really pushing, especially with the PlayStation era, this new adult, like kids want to be adults. They want this thing to look like a fucking thing that sits under your television, not a toy, And I think the PS1 gets caught up in this in a huge way. So very excited to talk about it. Thanks for indulging me on that little jaunt.
No, that context, Jeremy, just feeds and fuels all of this, which I feel like is just it really helps sort of color in where the world was at the time, where technology was, and where like we were. So thanks for sort of diving into that for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'll just kick us off with the with like my PlayStation history and like what I've been playing lately as like someone who has been dipping into the PlayStation 1. It was not a console that I owned growing up. It was a console that I would play at two specific friends' houses in my neighborhood when I would go to one friend's house because my mom, I didn't get into this context yesterday, but my mom was a cardiac nurse. And so before school, oftentimes she would go to work before we started school. So I would get dropped off at like one of a couple friends' houses who lived in the same neighborhood around the corner. So I could just be there like, for an hour, hour and a half before we'd start school. One of these friends, who I'll call my A Bug's Life friend, or I really should call my like Power Rangers friend, we would either watch the Power Rangers movie, Spice World, or we'd play his PlayStation 1, playing games like Rayman, A Bug's Life. Trying to think of other titles that he had. Those are the ones that come to mind. Oh, Parappa the Rapper he had. My other friend, who I would just like we hung out more. It was less of like, hey, you need to go here before something, but I would just go to my friend's house. He had games like Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, Heart of Darkness, Spyro the Dragon. So I loved seeing this console at other friends' house and was always so fascinated by it. But also, I was so content in my little world of Nintendo that I like never thought to ask for this or even that it could be mine. Not until way later. And then I had like one summer in high school where I borrowed a PlayStation 3 from my best friend growing up, Eddie Martin, who you both have met before on different podcasts. And I played the first disc of Final Fantasy VII and fell in love with it on a PlayStation 3, again, original PlayStation 3. And then in the summer of 2020, I bought a PS1, so the final console revision that came out, I think, in 2000 or so. The tiny little cute guy with a DualShock white controller. It's one of my favorite controllers I have. I built up a little collection. Our friend Charlie Mihalik, as he said last night, gave me like 10 PS1 games plus some other crap a few years ago that he was getting rid of. And I love this console now. It's one that like on the PSP Space Solace, I said that I felt like a PSP fraud because it was truly me looking back at all these games I never touched. I have a decent history with the PlayStation 1 and games that I now love. And to catch us up, the game I've been playing lately is the first Metal Gear Solid, which we've all discussed many times together, including on our Metal Gear Solid Games Club 3 years ago, which is crazy.
Wow.
And that's my all-time favorite PlayStation 1 game. So it really just does not get old turning that thing on. Yeah, that's pretty much my history with the PS1. I'm excited to play it more this year and just dive into it.
And I actually listened before we recorded the second Space Solace for PlayStation 1. I listened to the first PlayStation PS1 Space Solace, and Conner,
I started it too, dude.
You have like come into your own. Like in that first episode, you were like, I don't know what this console is. I guess I'll pick Spyro 3, and everybody was like, what the fuck?
Dude, I listened to that and I was like, what the fuck are you doing? Spyro 2 is way better.
Get your shit together.
So cool to become a PlayStation 1 expert like in 2020. You know what I mean? Like to have missed out on it. It's really like nostalgia stripped away. You are looking at the brass tacks and you do enjoy it. What a testament.
Yeah. McCollor, why don't you give us... I know I said brief, and then I actually think I went longer than I did last night, but why don't you go ahead?
Sure, yeah. I'm struggling to remember the first time I ever learned about the PlayStation. And I feel like... because I must have known it existed. I was big into EGM at the time, but I was a Super Nintendo kid and had it... like got a Super Nintendo right before the Nintendo 64 launched. Okay. And just like wasn't even thinking about the PlayStation. And it's a similar feeling I remember having for Legend of Zelda games until Ocarina of Time came out. I was just like, that's for older kids and it's not for me. And I think that's how I felt about the PlayStation. It always just felt like kind of cold and sort of the way I feel about PCs now. It's just like, I don't understand it. There's no warmth there. There's no joy to be had. But I definitely remember the first time I saw a commercial for Resident Evil 2 and there was a red monster hand. And I'm just going to tell this story every podcast I'm on now. When I go on my friend's discussion of politics and what the federal freezing of funds is. I'm going to say, but really quick, I did have a friend whose dad owned his own video game store, and he asked us what game we wanted to play when we were first going over there. And I said Resident Evil 2, and he said, you can't play that because we're playing it. So he set us up with Resident Evil 1. And like the first time playing Resident Evil 1 is like burned into my mind. I was just like, I couldn't fathom what was happening. I was like, where's the jump button? How does it look like this?
Jump button, he says.
It's just so obtuse. It's like I'm finding blue gems and I don't know what to do with them. So it's incredibly cool. I would trade in my Nintendo 64 to get a PlayStation 1 at some point. Wow. I remember going to GameStop. I guess it might have been Funko Land at the time. Trading in my Nintendo 64, getting a PlayStation 1, and the guy was in the back looking for it for a long time. I was like, what's going on? And my mom said like, well, he's just looking to make sure he gets you a real good one. And yeah, I just remember taking that home and I got Resident Evil 2. I already had Resident Evil 2. And then I was planning to go get so then I'm coming home and then like having my own copy of Resident Evil 2 truly made me feel like a rich man.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and then I just, slowly stuck with it. Ended up getting Metal Gear Solid, which is a game that means a ton to me as well. Ended up really loving Blasto, which we just talked about
Wow.
recently.
Yes.
Game that like weirdly like might be like part of my sense of humor. There's a lot more like non sequiturs and just like anticlimax jokes in that game that I really resonate with. But then yeah, those Resident Evils mean so much to me. Metal Gear Solid. I in terms of the games I'm playing now, I have just downloaded and I'm afraid to start it because I know I'm gonna love it so much and like it's right now it could be anything, but I am about to start Dino Crisis and actually get through it. I keep playing the first 5 minutes. I'm like, no, I need to have like an entire evening set aside and just like dive in. I can't give it a 15 minutes and bounce.
Yes. How are you gonna like? What's your setup for that experience?
It's all Steam Deck, baby.
Okay.
Steam Deck. I did buy it on PlayStation 5. It like just hit PSN, I want to say. So I bought it, and that was where I kept starting it and almost doing it. But now, since I've become a Steam Deck boy, that might be the only place I ever play video games again. The rest of my life.
Fair. I love that, dude.
Very cool.
Incredible. Thanks for catching us up too, Jer.
Yeah, my experience I think is so similar to Mikey's experience. I mean, it's like it mirrors in so many key ways. Like being of a certain age, like having like a weird time transitioning from the previous generation into the new 3D generation. Like weird in that like I'm not quite understanding it. It really was Mario 64 that I think I finally kind of went like, oh, like I get what's happening now. We're all doing this now. I think there's this window where the PS1 does come out in 95, but it's not like burning down the world yet. It really does take it. In my memory, it was Resident Evil. I think that's 96, and then Final Fantasy VII is 97. And I think it's like around 97 that I'm spending the night a lot at my friend Tommy's house, and his uncle who was like 16 at the he's there, and he's got the TV, and he's playing through Resident Evil, and we're like in our sleeping bags, like watching him do it, like freaked out. And then he's switching to Final Fantasy VII, and we're just like so engaged. And I remember like being so obsessed with seeing Resident Evil and seeing Final Fantasy VII that I would go home and just like make up stories about like what they were.
Wow.
And like write like I think the Albert Wesker means this, and I think that Jill is this, and like and Jill and Chris fall in love in every story I'm telling of it and stuff.
Cloud's actually a big reader. Yeah,
Cloud's a big reader. Yeah, and so I'm becoming like sort of obsessed with it, and I do have an N64. We did get that pretty close to like when it launched. Like that was a really big deal too. But it was the PlayStation again that like when I would move to Texas from California, my parents sort of got it for me like around my birthday, but also here you go. This is sort of a bigger birthday gift because we're moving you across the country. And yeah, it just felt like mine. And another thing that mirrors McCollor's experience is like the idea of feeling like a rich man is like I would actually describe it as more feeling like I'm growing up. Like I now have like I'm taking care of my games now. Like I'm not just like throwing the disc cases on the floor and putting them in a paper shredder. I'm actually like putting them neatly on the shelf, and I'm like and I'm rolling up my controller cable nice, and I'm trying not to get like gummy snacks like inside the controller buttons, you know. I'm becoming like I'm like 10 or like around 10 years old when I get one, or 11 years old, and that's kind of a transitionary period for a lot of people, I think. So I'm like, I'm learning to appreciate my stuff, and which becomes like even a problem later on in life when I'm just like, hey, no one touch, I'm policing like my wife accidentally bumps a controller with her foot and I have to go like decontaminate it or whatever. Because I'm like,
oh, dude, I play games with like friends at my place. Like if we've been eating something or like as someone sneezes, I'm like, I hate to be this person. You got to go wash your hands.
Dude,
You're
it's
not
so
touching
funny.
that controller.
It's so funny you say that because every game night we've ever had, we've always like brought all of our controllers
yes.
together. I have to I do this like ritual where I kind of go inward for just a second and I become okay with all my controllers getting destroyed. Like I become emotionally okay with it, and I always go, you can just buy new ones. You can just always just buy new ones. You don't have to like freak out if you see somebody eating pizza and then they go touch one of your NES controllers.
Nick Costanza puts a whole Joy-Con in his mouth. You just gotta be okay with it.
And I do that with like my niece and nephew too. I'm just like, it's okay.
Yes.
If they get destroyed, it's okay.
Okay.
I would love to have had this mindset. I still to this day like won't play a video game before I eat a leg of fried chicken just to really make sure the joystick gets clear.
Right.
I used to, while we're on the subject, I used to do this thing more often before my cat became a popcorn freak where I would eat popcorn or any little salty snack with chopsticks so that I could just put it back in the bowl and keep playing.
Yes, that's smart.
And then no one ever made fun of me for that, which is great. Never.
Well, great.
Anyway,
go ahead. And
Sorry,
and I would say that the PS1 game that I've sort of been dabbling around with more lately is that original Ape Escape. There are two games that I just completely had no interest in and didn't back in the day when they came out, and it was Metal Gear Solid and Ape Escape. I just, for whatever reason, you couldn't pay me $1 million to even figure out what Metal Gear Solid was. I remember seeing it like at a Toys R Us on its feet, like getting played. I was like, that just looks like crap. It looks like gray and gross and dingy. I didn't get it. I didn't get it at all. And Ape Escape was something that I just feel like the marketing was weird on that one, where I just didn't, for whatever reason, I didn't ever rent it or anything.
Well, it was the first DualShock exclusive. I got Ape Escape like day one because I wanted to get that controller. Like I think I knew about the DualShock happening, and like it was either I had the DualShock and wanted a game to use it on, or vice versa. Like I got Ape Escape and wanted to try the DualShock. That game did not need a DualShock.
Sure, yeah.
The second stick is 4 buttons.
Yeah, and
Very funny to me.
And I think it's really interesting how it only kind of works. Like I would much rather have a button to push to grab my apes with rather than using the other stick. But anyways, well,
even hearing you talk about this is not something we have time for, but it makes me, Jeremy, want to put in my copy of Ape Escape and play along with you.
Yeah.
And then do another recording. But I'm like, we already do a games club, which is enough fucking homework and scheduling. But
it's true. But if you do want to play through it, because I feel like I played in waves where I'll get closer and closer to like maybe one day beating that game.
Yes.
So if you ever finish it at any point this year, I'm sort of committed to finishing it at some point this year. So.
I do want to, outside of our my library shuffle streams, be kind of dabbling with it all year. I've got it hooked up to my CRT television in this room, and before playing Metal Gear Solid, I played a couple worlds of Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, my favorite Crash game. Didn't finish it, but I might pop it back in this year. So I hope to at least finish like, I don't know, maybe 3 PlayStation games and dabble with a bunch this year is sort of my idea.
I love that.
Jared, do you want to sort of take the reins here and just walk us through?
Yeah, so I think I gave everybody a copy of the show notes here. Again, if anything is coming up as we're doing this and you guys want to just stop and talk, please do. I mean, the idea is not, hopefully that I won't be just like paraphrasing like information from the internet, but that we'd have like some kind of discussion about it. But some of this is just informative. So,
totally.
We're starting out with sort of what the PlayStation 1 is, and it's not that I don't think people listening don't know what it is, but it's I think it's interesting to like refresh our brains into some of the dates and some of the facts that go into like a PS1. So yeah, obviously codenamed PSX, abbreviated as PS. This was the first home console by Sony, which we now know is one of the big 3 manufacturers and developers of video game consoles. Sega is still in the conversation at this point with their Sega Saturn, and then a Nintendo 64. That would be the big three that was actually, relevant at the time when this console came out. It came out in December of '94 in Japan. I actually didn't realize that it had come out so late in '94. When people say it came out in '94, we're talking it just barely came out in '94, and
and missed Black Friday.
And missed Black
who's
Friday
getting it for Christmas?
Exactly, and it's so like a 1995 experience, right, for both Japan and America. It came out in September of '95 in America, and also in Europe. So there's a very famously Sony began developing the PlayStation after a failed venture with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the early 90s. We all kind of know this story. It happened at a CES event where they make this big announcement, and then the very next morning, Nintendo. I love the way it's worded on Wikipedia. I'll just describe it. Let's see if I can find the sentence. It was so funny. It was called. Oh yeah. So at 9 a.m. on the next day, this is after the Nintendo and PlayStation announced that their partnership. In what has been called the greatest ever betrayal in the industry, Howard Lincoln stepped onto stage and revealed that Nintendo was now allied with Philips and would abandon their work with Sony. Okay, and
that's cool.
This is something that would never happen today. I mean, this would be really nuts, and I think there'd be so much legal red tape around it. You would never make this move today. Even Nintendo wouldn't.
I didn't know this was even like publicly announced. I feel like in my head, it was like one of those stories that came out in like a Jason Schreier book. Like,
right.
Did you know Nintendo was working with Sony? And I was like, no. And now it's 2002.
It was kind of so far down the line that there exist, and they are obviously very expensive, working full prototypes of this PlayStation Super Nintendo hybrid. Have you guys ever seen one of these out in the wild?
It is maybe the most beautiful console I've ever seen.
And it plays with Super Nintendo controllers. It's so interesting, but you can play Resident Evil 1 on a Super Nintendo PlayStation 1 with a Super Nintendo controller.
We've talked about this, Jeremy. That's my dream.
It is so cool looking. It's so crazy that all of the bits and bobs and pieces of the PlayStation 1 are in this thing. It's like fully just a PS1.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about this that's so funny to me. It really feels like this is the Doki Doki Panic story for consoles, where everyone's like, hey, did you know Super Mario Brothers 2 is actually, that's this, but for the PlayStation and how the PlayStation came to be. There's a lot about leading up to this that like I have like ingested from many YouTube videos over the years, or research that I've done, or podcasts that I've listened to, and hearing about how like Nintendo's relationship with Sony started and how they got to the point of basically being betraying them and making it so that they were not going to be working together on a console any longer. It like, do you mind if I talk about like the Super Nintendo sound chip at all and how we got into that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I mean, this is context that I'm sure a lot of people know, but like Sony before getting into video games was just known as like a high-end consumer like electronics manufacturer of television sets, VCRs, boom boxes. They created the Walkman.
The Walkman, yeah.
Ooh, just nuts. So they were, like a lot of people, I think because of the video game crash and because video games of this era, despite Sega's market, a choice in how they marketed their console, were still considered to be more of like a toy than like an adult's gaming system. And so they were really apprehensive about getting involved in the gaming market. But they would go on to make the sound chip for the Super Nintendo. I think it was called the SMP, which has 4 times the RAM of the Genesis sound chip and 2 more audio channels that they can use. What that does, I couldn't tell you. I just know the facts.
Okay, thank
So
you.
they had been working with Nintendo to develop the sound chip for the Super Nintendo, and which is one of the things the console's known for. I mean, I also really like, despite not being a Genesis kid, I like the way that the Genesis sounds. I don't know if it's just because I'm like, ooh, it's messed up and gross, but I really like both sound chips. What about you guys?
Hate Genesis.
Hate.
I
What
hate
the
its
heck?
music.
Really?
There's nothing about the Sega Genesis I have affection for.
Oh my god! I mean, kind of me too. Like, I mean, I always wanted one, but I didn't have one, so I don't have a lot of nostalgia for it. But I think that the Genesis sound chip is considered to be like, what's the word? Like, better is a weird word. It's not better than the Super Nintendo sound chip. It's that
It's
it's
like different
more
strengths.
sought after. It's more musical. People like it, I think, so much better. The Super Nintendo sound chip kind of sounds like mud in a lot of ways. The
It
Sega
uses a
Genesis
lot of,
one is like, you can Anamanaguchi uses that shit. You know what I'm talking about?
dude, Anamanaguchi.
Like
That
that's
sounds
it's a
Gucci.
highly sought out. People are literally buying Genesis to rip the sound chip out and put it in their musical equipment because they like it so much. It's got a punch to it.
It's so weird to like try to rank video game music on its own because I don't have any like affection for any Sega Genesis games, but every time I'm like the best music of all time, it's like, yeah, 35 Super Nintendo songs. Even for like the Secret of Manas and Final Fantasies of the world, I'm like, yeah, that's beautiful. And then all the Sega Genesis music, it just sounds like farting.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like I
That's
hear a lot
funny.
of farting in the Super Nintendo sound chip, but I do have an affinity for both. Yeah, the SNES sound chip is like, so I think it does a lot of like sampling from like instruments and stuff, whereas the Genesis might have, I can't even describe the difference, but I know it when I hear it. Anyway, that's how the relationship of Sony and Nintendo began, was working on this sound chip. And Jeremy, I know you've got some stuff about Ken Kutaragi in here a little later, but do we get into the development of the add-on and then the original console, or
Yeah, I
should I
mean,
just
I mean,
blurb that out now?
as like an overview. I mean, we could talk about this in great depth and detail forever. So it's kind of to taste. I probably wouldn't go so heavy into the technical specs of everything, just
Yes.
because I also don't really understand the technical specs of everything so much. But suffice it to say, this relationship didn't last. That's sort of the bigger overall, I think, point of this moment in time. But then also, Connor, something you did mention that I think is important is how fucking risky it would be for Sony to get into the video game space. Like, the reason why you want to partner with Nintendo is because they're already established, they already have hardware, and they already have market share, like a piece of the pie. Getting into a space like this is not just risky, it's expensive. It's just so expensive. You got to basically market from the ground up what the hell your thing even is. And Sony, unlike a company like Microsoft, who ends up doing this a little bit later, doesn't have all the money in the world. Like, that's something to always consider when you look at the console race today, is that the Microsoft can fail for the rest of time because they have an infinite bottomless pit of money that comes from their PC sales and their operating system sales. Like, Microsoft is a juggernaut, whereas Sony is a fledgling, always barely surviving Japanese electronics company. So the fact that they are so successful with the PlayStation is a testament to just how smart they were, I think, about the PlayStation from the beginning.
Yeah, go ahead, McCollor.
I also kind of feel like, and I have nothing to back this up with, but it does feel like Nintendo kind of opened the door for it, just in terms of like sticking with cartridges so steadfastly when like famously Square was like, can we have more space? Can you just do a disc thing? And they're like, no. And that opens the door for all of a sudden, like, Final Fantasy VII becomes a PlayStation exclusive because it physically can't exist on the Nintendo 64. So it is, you're right. It's such a like confident, bold decision, but it also like had the door opened for them by Nintendo, being pretty Nintendo-y, actually, sticking to an idea well beyond its expiration date.
Yeah, and you kind of get the sense that Sega was doing the same thing, and I think it must have something to do with the incredible success, or at least like at least some amount of success in the 16-bit markets. They had come from the 2D generation, and no one was quite sure, I think at the time, what was going to happen next. But if you were, I think, on the outside of that experience, like Sony was, it was very easy to say like, we need to develop 3D gaming. That's where everything is heading. Let's do this. What people want. Doom is already out. Like, let's just do it. Let's do 3D. And so Ken Kutaragi, primarily designed, and just lightly outsourced to United Kingdom, his new 3D polygonal graphic console that would end up becoming the PlayStation 1. It was also developed very obviously with third-party support in mind from the jump. So they kind of knew right away, like, hey, like, we're not going to be able to develop like on our own the same way Nintendo kind of is able to do. You know what I mean? Like, Nintendo has all this we call them first party, but what we mean is like developed in-house in a lot of cases, like, you know, the Marios and the Zeldas and whatnot. Sony doesn't really have that. They, you know, if we think about all the Sony first-party games, they're all made by third-party developers like Square and Konami and Ubisoft. Rare.
Dude, yeah.
I'm looking, like, I'm realizing, like, I don't remember when we got our first, like, official PlayStation Studios game.
Well, I know we were talking about Ape Escape earlier. That's Sony Computer Entertainment Japan. But those, I think to Jeremy's point too, like, those studios don't make that many games anymore. / I think I want to even say like Sony Japan was like disbanded last year or something. So
right,
it is a lot of like working with like we're thinking of God of War. That's Sony Santa Monica working with Sony. We think of Spider-Man now. That is what are they called? Insomniac Studios. Naughty Dog is still a huge arm of Sony, but yeah, Jeremy, you make a really great point.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I mean, and this becomes a huge arms race. Basically, they are trying to secure third-party developers and third-party support really early on. And one of which, a huge one early on, is Bandai Namco. I mean, without Tekken and Ridge Racer, like the PS1 is like might be in trouble, if that makes sense. They also secure a port of Tomb Raider early on, which becomes a big deal because Tomb Raider was how the Saturn was selling its consoles. It was like, we have Tomb Raider and Gex. And it was like Gex, very tiny, and Rayman, I suppose, as well. They had a few things, but really it was Tomb Raider was the showstopper because it was the 3D environments, 3D platform.
That's a love triangle I want to see. Lara Croft, Gex, and Rayman.
Baby.
Like who's gonna date who?
Yeah.
I want to add a tiny bit of context to this, Jeremy, of both Sony getting into the gaming market and how apprehensive they were, like you were saying, but also of them not knowing how to develop games at the start. The additional context I want to add for getting into working with games in general is that there was sort of like a backdoor deal that Kutaragi had made with Nintendo to develop this sound chip, and by the time that was already going, they kind of just gave the thumbs up to it. But so there was that, and the apprehensivity continued. It was a bunch of like, oh no, we're already this far into it, let's just do it. And then by the time Nintendo screwed them over at that CES, they were just like, we're just actually, Sony itself was like, we're actually going to continue doing this out of spite, basically.
And revenge is a powerful motivator.
It really is. The other thing I wanted to add was before Sony ended up going off and doing, their PlayStation themselves, after like this rift between them and Nintendo happened, they actually had a little studio that they had built that wasn't developing any games, and so they ended up partnering with Sega briefly to develop some of the Sega CD games and some 32X stuff, like titles that I didn't know this until this morning, and I know these games: Sewer Shark, Night Trap, Ultimate Warrior. I think I might be missing up that title, but
Former
they
Intercontinental Champion.
they worked with Sega to even learn how to get into this process. So it's
And
always
what
like
process is that? What do you? I'm sorry. Like, are you talking about
games development.
Okay, because Sony developed games for the Super Nintendo as well. Like,
Maybe I'm thinking more of the CD-based stuff of working
maybe,
with the
yeah.
Sega CD and 32X from earlier. That might be what I'm thinking of specifically.
Yeah, it wasn't like they had never developed like a game before. They had developed. They had a very small gaming wing, but I think like in the next generation, I think for the next generation, like like them being able to like develop stuff like in the 3D gaming space.
Maybe that's
was
exactly what it was. And
Yeah.
and the name I have for this company is Sony ImageSoft, which
Yeah.
you'll see that little logo on some of these, and maybe even the same studio you're referring to.
A lot of licensed games came out of Sony ImageSoft. Like the Hook game is developed by Sony ImageSoft, or at least published by Sony.
One of your faves.
Oh, I'm looking at the feather logo now, and this does. I do remember this on some Super Nintendo games.
Yeah.
Super Dodgeball, for instance.
For instance, just to throw out a couple of bangers, Super Dodgeball. Yeah. So, like, Conner, anything else about like the sort of the early days of this before we get into E3?
There's one thing I almost forgot too, as well. And first of all, I need to reference this video specifically. I've watched a ton of videos on this, but I do want to shout this one out, and I might even cite it in the notes here that I watched, titled the PS1 Changed Gaming: Complete History of PlayStation Part 1. This is for from RES Retrospective, the channel. And the last little detail that I had is that there was almost as well, we all know about the Super Nintendo PlayStation or whatever. There was also a near Sega Sony console as well that just basically at the last minute, like Sony was on board and Sega USA was on board, but when they brought it to Sega Japan, they were like, "We're not doing this." That's the last
sucks.
additional thing.
Ugh. Can you imagine, by the way, an alternate history where the PlayStation and the Saturn actually just smash together and become one thing? PlayStation already dominated that generation. That would have they would have killed everything. Everything would be over.
Because it feels like Sony's like, well, we don't need them to do this, so why would we get into this partnership? And nowadays, it's like, turns out Sony didn't. Well, I guess they learned some from Sega, but they didn't need them either.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you mean Sega didn't need Sega was thinking we don't need Sony.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like kind of flipped around, and Sega ends up crawling back as a gaming developer to all of them later.
Dude, it's so sad.
Conner,
I know.
Do you know that timeline between the Sony Sega collaboration and the Sony Nintendo collaboration?
I believe Sega, that was definitely afterwards, kind of like out of an enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of thing.
Because I do like this like potential rewriting of it where like Nintendo finds out like, I'm sorry, you're talking to Sega, and that's what leads to the split.
Yeah, we want it to make sense because we want there to be a reason, I think. But I think there just isn't a good reason. It just was like bad business stuff.
I want Nintendo to be the good guy. It feels bad that they would do this to a company that I also end up liking and creating their biggest rival and eventual destructor.
And I know I keep saying that was the last thing I wanted to share. I actually have one little nugget I want to share with you guys as well. That because we know about the deal falling apart between them and Nintendo choosing to like last minute we're going to go with Philips. But a big part of that was because in the early negotiations when they were agreeing to work on the add-on and this standalone Sony Nintendo console is that in the agreement, Nintendo had agreed to basically license like all of the software sales that were going to be made from this thing were going to go to Sony, and Nintendo only be making money off the hardware. I think this is for the add-on specifically. And that obviously was not going to be a good deal for Nintendo, because I think, isn't it famously you lose money on all hardware, or like all like gaming
That they say
developers?
that. They definitely say that. I
Yeah,
think
whether
that
or not
that's
it's
been
true.
truer and falser at different times in history. But like
I
they
feel like
said
I've
that
heard,
Praise.
yeah, the PlayStation 5 is the I think the famous example of these days what people say is they have to take a hit on the hardware because there's just they wouldn't
Mhm.
be able to sell it at retail for any kind of
Interesting.
reasonable price.
Yeah,
This does feel like a little bit of the gaming. Like sometimes people put razor blades in apples. Like I don't know
Yeah.
how true it is, but it's like kind of common knowledge. I feel like I remember hearing a journalist type gaming somebody say that Nintendo was always the company that was different. Nintendo would always make a tiny little profit on hardware. So
Mm.
if there was going to be a company that was going to be okay with just taking a hardware a bit of profit, it would be them. But
mm,
Yeah, and I also think that a lot of this has to do with the kind of deals that you're brokering with your manufacturers, right? So like Nintendo famously has a lot of like I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine when it comes to like buying parts for like their consoles.
mm,
So I think that it wouldn't surprise me if Nintendo does make a little bit of a profit, whereas like Sony and some of these other companies, they also have these kind of plates spinning. But I don't think that I think depending on where you're at in that kind of negotiation could depend on how much profit you're making
mm,
on your console at market.
mm.
I also feel like that's what those like mid-gen console refreshes were about. Like if we
Oh
can just
yeah.
get this chip a little cheaper, then all of a sudden we're turning profit on it. I'm saying a lot of things that I
No.
feel are true.
No, 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 no.
But I think that's the
I've heard
case.
as much. I've heard as much. Like
Yeah.
in fact, sometimes these it does both things at once where a chip will come out that is cheaper to make and better and more powerful than the one in your previous console. I think that was the case in the Xbox 360 where like those
Mm.
revisions were about not only can we make this console better and faster and safer and cleaner and better for the environment, but it's also more powerful too and quieter. Like it was like it's like accomplishing a lot at
Mm,
the same time.
mm.
And we also know that like the Switch. Well, I mean, this is like I think this is true. The Switch 2, one of the impetuses for even doing a Switch 2 is that the now the parts for the Switch 1 are more expensive and more hard to find because they're
Mm.
older. Like just like there is better technology out there that the Switch 2 is going to be able to utilize I mean that's why they end up retiring consoles is not because it's like they're never going to make money on them again. It's because it's too expensive to source all that stuff. So I
Interesting.
think you're right, McCollor. I think definitely you're right. I don't think it's just a
Thank you.
feeling. I think it's I think it's a
It's
true.
more than a feeling, I might say.
Yeah. Um great. So yeah, I mean the console it writes history. It ends up becoming this big historical monument. But first, we got to get through the launch of it. So, let's talk a little bit about the Japan launch of the PlayStation 1. So I find that this is like the do or die and stay the course moment for Sony because Sega already has it's huge in Japan. I mean, when the Saturn launches, it launches a week before the PlayStation 1 in Japan. So it's 1994. It's December, right? Or maybe late November for the Saturn. It comes out a week before the PS1. Everyone's buying these Sega Saturns. Everyone's excited about the Saturn initially. It sells about 500,000 units in its like first couple of months. PlayStation 1 sells about 300,000.
Hmm.
It's not doing terrible. It's not tanking in Japan, but it's not quite doing the sales that the Saturn is doing. However, buzz starts to generate around this thing. The word is starting to get out, and it ends up becoming kind of a hotter. They call it a gray market item, where suddenly people internationally are starting to hear tale of the PlayStation 1, and they're wanting to get their hands on it. So they're paying premiums of up to $700 to like get a PlayStation 1. And frame of reference, the $300 price point of the PS1 at the time would have been about a $600 purchase today. So if you're paying $700, boy, you really want this thing. This is upwards of $1,000 by today's standards. So yeah, Japan always kind of does its own thing. We know this. Like the Saturn actually doesn't really tank in Japan the same way it tanks in the US, just because they really love certain games that never really get old to them, especially during this time. A lot of stuff like 2D sprite-based fighters, those dominate the market. Shooters, like shoot 'em ups, like, Raiden and, Darius and, you know what I'm talking about, like the space shooters where it's just
Equinox.
Yeah, bullet hell type stuff.
Yes.
Yeah,
Einhander is what I was thinking of, and the word Equinox is what came out of my brain.
I'm calling it Equinox from now
on. Mahjong games, huge over there, and the Saturn is doing a lot of that stuff really well. It's able, and it kind of contends in that space for its entire run. But Sony's got its eyes on the United States. It wants to do well over here. So there's a very famous E3 that I think E3 1995 that everybody sort of references, where Sega does a couple of things wrong when they decide to announce their latest, hottest console to the United States. The first thing they do is they set it at a price point of $399 for a Sega Saturn. That's high. That is more expensive than a Nintendo Switch was when it came out. The Switch was $299, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. It was.
So to be launching your console at $399 in the United States, very risky, especially when you ain't got no Sonic the Hedgehog right away, all ready to go for that thing. The other big mistake they make is they launch it the same day they announce it, folks. A very unprecedented, weird move that ends up pissing off retailers so bad, some won't even carry the thing. Like KB Toys doesn't even carry the Sega Saturn. They're so angry.
And like you're saying, this is just essentially they decided that day, we're going to do this. It wasn't something that was in the works. It wasn't a plan that they had. It wasn't something, obviously, they were telling distributors about.
It's certainly a weird game of chess, right? If you know that your competitor is about to announce something pretty cool, how do you contend with this? Well, they made a choice, and it was to launch right away, like as if that was going to surprise and impress everybody. I think it just made everybody, especially at that showroom, panic. Nobody knew what to do. Everyone immediately started trying to figure out how they could buy one or figure out how to secure one. It was kind of a mess. Sony ends up doing something a little bit more bold and daring. And I don't know, Connor, and if in any of your research you found this out, but did they make this choice to slash the price sort of in the moment? They did that, right? It wasn't like a thing.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, it was sort of, so they see Saturn make this call, and then I can't, do you have the name of the person who does it on stage?
The guy who did it, who made the announcement? Well, I don't
even know if he says anything. Famously, what he does is he walks on stage and just slashes the price from $399 to $299.
$299.
That is such a...
it's... Okay, here we go. I'm finding it. But yeah, the price heard around the world is the way that this video is framing it. Let's see the name. So it's at the E3 1995 keynote. God, who is this guy? I promise I'll get you guys a good answer.
I think his name is
It's not. I saw the name Olaf Olafsson, but I don't think that's him.
It must be Olaf
Crash
Olafsson.
Bandicoot?
Yeah. It's
Crash?
David Hayter got up there. And, yeah. So, anyways, as Connor's kind of maybe looking that up, maybe we'll get a name to.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about
that. Put to a name to put to the moment here.
I've got it.
Oh yeah.
So Sony Computer Entertainment of America President Steve Race.
Steve Race. The guy is a clever move. $299. That pretty much does it. That pretty much secures its place in the annals of video game history, and it makes it almost a guarantee that folks are going to at least consider the Sony PlayStation over the Sega Saturn. And if that wasn't bad enough, their showcase was pretty hot that year. They show games like Ridge Racer, Tekken, and Wipeout, games that the Sega Saturn can only dream of having on their console, and Michael Jackson shows up in their presentation.
Great stunt.
Not bad. Any thoughts on this moment in history? I mean, at the time, I'm obviously not aware that this is going on. I have no idea. I don't even think E3s were they were not even close to what they end up becoming, which is like these big, like almost consumer driven moments where people can go play games on the showroom and stuff. I mean, that might have been happening at the time, but we're talking like sweaty guys in suits are sitting around this.
Well, this was specifically for distributors, right? That's my understanding of like original E3 was that like the executives from places like a KB Toys could go and see what video games were coming in, like order their stock for the coming holiday season, right?
Oh,
so
certainly,
if you've got Sony making a choice that's going to like get you in their good graces, that you've got this great product that you can sell for cheap, and then you've got Sega that's like screwing up your entire plan, like those guys are going to react well. I was very fascinated, Jeremy, when you were talking about how like what a risk it was for Sony to get into this, like how much development time it takes to like build up the idea of a library, and to come out of the gate that confident. Like what a cool move. Like feels very fake it till you make it, but like damn, I'd have been impressed.
And I think one contributing factor to this that we now kind of know is that Sega might have made smarter choices had it not been for what was going on between Sega of America and Sega Japan at the time. They were basically going through a divorce. Yeah, they Sega of America and Sega Japan could not get like on the same page about how the Saturn was going to be developed, like what it was going to focus on, and I think, and I mean, I could be wrong about this because I'm far less familiar with how the Saturn's history was to the PlayStations, but I think it's because the U.S. definitely wants to move forward. The U.S. from a business standpoint is like, we need to compete in these spaces where I think Sega Japan is like kind of hanging behind. They're not catching up. They're not reading the room, so to speak. And this leads to a lot of like bizarre conflict. Also,
it's why we
Sega,
have Eggman and Dr. Robotnik. Like Japan wanted him, Eggman.
Yeah,
I think that's true.
Yeah,
Did you guys know that
might be true.
Supposed to be he was one of the many original designs by Sonic Team to potentially be like the mascot for Sonic. Was that he was a different character design, supposed to be a hero, but they liked him so much after they chose Sonic that they just kept him in and kind of redesigned him as the villain.
Is that true?
I just learned about this the other week. Yeah, it's one of the fun facts on my latest Call Me By Your Game episode.
That's really interesting if that's true, because
he looks villainous.
Well, he does look villainous, but if you cuted him up a bit, he's not too dissimilar from Mario.
Whoa.
They are some distant he's like him and Mario and Wario are all kind of related.
Yeah, like he does kind of look like Mario if you grossed him up and made him a villain.
Yeah. I love that.
It does feel like this will be like one of the alternate timelines in the next, like in Fantastic Four. They'll be like, how do we establish this as a different universe? And it'll just be Eggman as the Sega mascot, and the Nintendo PlayStation is struggling because they stuck with cartridges too long.
Oh yeah, that's another big thing that we should talk about is like CD-ROM based gaming is like the new hot thing, and what that essentially allows you to do is just like store a lot more game on the disc than you could on a cartridge.
Almost 7 times as much from the cartridges they're working on, and at least the SNES nuts. To CD.
Just so nuts.
And it's never been more clear, like, because like Sony can do FMVs, and I just remember in the days before whatever miracle allowed Resident Evil 2 to end up on the Nintendo 64, just like this game doesn't function. There's just like a whole level of artistry that you can do in Sony PlayStation games.
Oh yeah, 100%. And like the choice to remain on cartridges doesn't just mean that your games are going to like kind of look potentially worse and sound potentially worse, but they're going to be way more expensive. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but like N64 games were unattainable at the time when they came out. $70 for an N64 game, or $79.99 in some cases, at like the minimum. When my parents buy Pilot Wings, it is for $60-$70. It's like so. Whereas you don't really see. Well, at first I think the pricing was all over the place with the PlayStation 1 games, but eventually it would become $49.99 MSRP. Like that's how much a new game costs. Kind of period. They do try to sell the multi-disc games for more money, I think, but I don't know if that sticks forever. But anything else about the sort of launch and before we get into the games, the launch games that happened for the PlayStation?
No, not really for me.
I'm ready to talk games.
All right, let's talk about Japan first. Okay, so Japan, obviously, they get to market first, and they have a slate of games. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Japan only PlayStation 1 games at launch. You probably recognize at least one name on this list if you're looking at the I
recognize only one game on this list.
I was curious to know if anybody recognized any other games other than Ridge Racer on this list. We'll go through each one of them, but I first want to check in.
No, not a one for me.
Parodius? No one recognizes Parodius? Okay.
It feels like made up.
That is a game that Parodius, I think, is a game that it has arcade history and is like it's like a shmup. It's a shmup that like it's a cute 'em up, I think they call it, where it's just like a very cute shooter. But let's go through each one. So A4 Evolution Aresha de Iku 4 is a simulation game that comes out. So think like Sim City. If you look at thumbnails or images of this game, very crude, very, very gross looking, but a style of game that would have been sort of popular at the time. I just threw a link to Moby Games in the chat if you guys want to see the
Jeremy.
source where I'm getting this from. And it'll allow you to kind of click around on games, and it'll show you like some screenshots and stuff.
Thank you, buddy.
Of course. So yeah, I have no experience with this game and never will, and can't look at it anymore.
Bad.
There's a game called Crime Crackers that comes out. This game I actually am interested in. This is a weird first-person shooter that comes out, sort of in the Doom vein, but it's also sort of a cute 'em up. If you look at some of the images from it, you're shooting these little like donut-looking circles at like monsters in the overworld. It's got sort of an anime aesthetic. This is one of the few in this list that I'm actually would be the slightest bit interesting in just like throwing on someday and just like seeing how it works and how it plays.
It looks cool. It looks like, and I kind of got this sense from sort of poking through a video of a lot of these launch games. They look like cool Super Nintendo games.
Yes, that's very important, I think, to note. Thank you for bringing that up. Most of these games, with the notable exception of Ridge Racer, are games that you could see them sort of finagling on the Super Nintendo, like pushing the Super Nintendo as hard as they could to like get them to play on here. And isn't that sort of how most new consoles operate? They kind of just are like a little bit better versions of like that launch like slate is always just like a little bit better than what you saw on the previous console.
Each game has like their one bullet point that they can say, this is something we could only do on the PlayStation. And even just looking at Castle Crackers is like, these are pretty cool little anime renders down at the bottom. Like I can't imagine that being on screen the entire time on a Super Nintendo game.
Yeah.
So you get your bullet point and then you move on.
100%. And I've also seen this game be played, and like there's just a smoothness to the moving around in first person that it just you couldn't do on the Super Nintendo. Like if you've ever tried to play Doom, there's a Super Nintendo version of Doom, and it's just, you're crawling through the world of it. You're not floating through it like you would on the PC. There are 2 Mahjong games that come out. I do think that this is very funny that there are 2, and McCollor, also to your point, if you see on the thing I sent you, there are at least one game here, this Mahjong game, that is also on the Super Nintendo. They're like they're some of these are launching for both Super Nintendo and PlayStation. But one of these Mahjong games is an exclusive. We have a game called Neketsu Oyaku, which is a third-person action game. It's a beat-em-up, essentially. This game also shows up on the Sega Saturn. And again, kind of to your point, McCollor, which I love so much, is you can kind of see this being on the Super Nintendo as well, but if you look at the sprites, they are just bigger and more colorful, and the world looks a little more, there's more depth to it. Some of these things would be very hard to achieve on a Super Nintendo. Parodius is the next game on the list. That is, like I described before, it is an arcade shooter. It's made by Konami. I think there's Parodius games on the NES. I mean, I think it has like sort of a long tail on it.
Even
but
just the title itself, when we were looking at it, I was internally thinking like, sounds a lot like the names of other like shmups. Maybe it's a shmup, and of course it is.
Yes. Oh yeah. You can kind of guess a shmup by its yeah.
In my head, every PlayStation launch game is a shmup.
Yeah. I think the original Parodius, yeah, it's a 1988 game. There's a 1990 version. And then I think this comes out as maybe a game called Fantastic Journey in the United States. But Ridge Racer is, in fact, the showstopper. There is some precedent for Ridge Racer with Virtua Racing. I think kind of beats this to market, as there is a version of Virtua Racing on the Genesis and the 32X and the Sega CD. But it will not play even close to as good as what this game can do. And this is just an arcade racer that is in a completely 3D rendered environment. And
I don't think
go ahead.
I don't think I could have recalled this first Ridge Racer or any of them being from the first person perspective, but that's what this looks like. I always think of Gran Turismo, which is the third person.
Well, they are. Most of these games will allow you to change your camera, so it's not just first person. You are able to see your car if you want that.
I wonder if this first Ridge Racer had that though. I wonder if that's like a way to save some processing power, as you don't have to render the player's car.
Maybe. I think that the first person view is mostly for if you bought the steering wheel peripheral. Like that is sort of the what you would want to access to kind of do the pedal and wheel. I never owned one of those growing up. Did you guys ever?
No, never.
No, would never.
Yeah.
I just dropped in the chat. The YouTube video I'm looking at is just a collection of every PS1 game from 1994.
There you go.
And I've been kind of poking through this timeline of games, and even just going from the Crime Crackers and AIV4 Evolution to Ridge Racer. Like, I got myself in the mindset. I was like, "Damn, Ridge Racer looks good as hell. This is sick." I'm in the 1994 headspace, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it really is impressive, especially when the last racing game you might have played at your house was Mario Kart. You know? There's another game. The final game on this list is called Tama. And Tama looks kind of nuts to me. There's, if you have that video open that McCollor sent, you can kind of mute it and like look at Tama. It makes me kind of want to throw up, but I'm also like can't look away. There's like a giant hand that's like removing parts of the world, and like a little ball. It feels like a physics-based game that's like about getting a ball into a certain place. This is also shows up on the Saturn. Long story short, I gotta play Tama.
This is cool.
There
were puzzles like this in Resident Evil 8. You'd find little house miniatures, and you have to rotate them to get the ball around.
I love that.
This game is a morph ball puzzle.
Yeah,
this is a morph ball puzzle. What are we doing?
It's a morph ball puzzle.
This game looks cool.
I think I'll, in addition to the video I did some research with, I'm gonna save this link too, and I'll have a little citation. So if people want to kind of scroll through this video as they're listening or whatever, they'll have the option.
Yes, I love that. So yeah, this is this sort of. There are other games that show up on this this video that I'm very interested in. I do believe that they are what is considered to be launch window games, as opposed to like day one. You could go to the store and pick up all 8 of these titles if you wanted to. Because I'm noticing there's a couple of very interesting ones. And maybe we will. Maybe we should talk about them just a little bit briefly now. Nah, let's move on to the U.S. Let's move on to the U.S. launch house. Let's keep it clean. Let's keep it nice here. I just saw that Kingsfield was on the on the Japanese, and I was like, really? Wow, that came out. That was a launch.
FromSoft?
That is Dark Souls Prime.
That's
Whoa.
insane.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the U.S. launch. Now, this is very as for a little context, extremely common back in the day that if a console was going to launch in Japan, it had much less games, much like less appealing titles, and by the time it makes its way to the US, they've beefed up that list and made it just a little bit more enticing. And I do kind of think that the PS1 initial list here is it's not that bad. There are definitely console launches that have gone worse than this. So let's start at the top here. We have Battle Arena Toshinden. This is a very famous game that was a precursor to Tekken on the PS1 as a 3D fighter. This game also, I believe, yes, it also predates Tekken on the console, obviously, because Tekken's not on this list. It does pretty quickly gets pushed aside in favor of Tekken. But did anyone ever play this game?
Just familiar from afar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do feel like it was a game that a lot of people owned. Like I can picture it in libraries, but yeah, I never touched it.
It's kind of notable for being like a weapons fighter before the Soul Calibur series.
Oh yeah,
comes up. ESPN2 Extreme Games is another game.
Jeremy, don't you like to go extreme games mode on people?
I do like to go extreme games mode on people.
It does kind of look like an X Games or maybe what it was called beforehand.
Yes, yeah. I actually have a game called 2 Extreme that was like a sequel to this game.
Okay.
Basically, this would be like if Tony Hawk was made by the developers of Mortal Kombat 1. So, like, instead of having like 3D models, it's like that Mortal Kombat 1, like where they've kind of mocapped people and like Donkey Kong Country style. And I just remember doing like a rollerblading mission, and it's fucked up. This is a fucked up game. No one should play it. But interesting that they have it, and interesting
the
for like
game. Is it called 1 Extreme?
This on this list, it's called ESPN2 Extreme Games, but there is like a title that says 1 Extreme on when you look at the visual. So I'm not quite sure.
Okay, yeah. This video is saying that this was a launch title for the PlayStation 1. It's called ESPN Extreme Games /1 Extreme.
1 Extreme, yeah. So, maybe they were having problems with their naming conventions then. It sounds like they definitely abandoned the length of it for 2 Extreme for the sequel.
Whatever happened with Tom Cruise's Live, Die, Repeat movie.
Yeah.
Sometimes you change the title after it's out.
You got to. Kill Leak is another fascinating looking shooter that came out. It's a 3D shooter that kind of a sci-fi inspired, looking a lot like that Alien Trilogy game. I think that was maybe the one you were bringing up yesterday on the Solace McCollor. That kind of Doom
first-person
style
shooter. Yeah, with like 3D rendered backgrounds.
Yeah, you are a mech in this game, and This is sort of what, when I look at screenshots of this game, this is sort of what gaming in the 90s was all about, I feel like. Just like gross looking mech shooters. They looked like enticing, but then you'd play them and then they would just like really let you down. That's kind of what this game looks like to me. NBA Jam Tournament Edition gets a great port on the PS1.
That's a pretty freaking great game too.
Yeah, it's pretty damn good. Yeah, not a lot of thoughts about this version of NBA Jam other than it clearly is.
That's like
looking nicer than it ever has.
And I think there are other games on this list that are really solid and you know what you're going to get, but I feel like this is really a title that, because it had been around before, you really knew what you're going to get. I think there's a version of it on the Super Nintendo, probably the Genesis as well. Probably it was an arcade port as well.
Yeah.
On the Jaguar.
Yeah, that would feel like a safe bet if I'm a kid and I'm like, ugh, I can only buy one game for this PlayStation on this launch window. I know this is going to be good, so maybe I'll go with it.
Oh, it definitely reminds me of buying Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the N64, where it was like, oh, maybe one thing I do want to have is like the ultimate best version of the thing I liked on the previous gen, just to have.
Yes.
Or like maybe even like Tony Hawk 3 on the PS2 or something, where you're just like,
or Tears of the Kingdom that we're going to buy again on Switch 2.
Yeah, I mean, like quite literally that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Power Serve is a tennis game.
Looks like
this looks like
to the PlayStation.
Exclusive to the PlayStation. It's developed by Ocean. Does anyone remember Ocean software from the previous generation?
What did they wait? No. Is it Echo? Or is it just because they're called Ocean that I'm calling them the Echo the Dolphin people?
That's my thought.
I don't know. I cannot confirm or deny that. But they were just very popular on the Super Nintendo and let me see if we can find.
Yeah, I clicked on the link and it took me to like a Bandai Namco Ocean developers games.
Yeah, it looks like they did a lot of Super Nintendo stuff. Addams Family, Cool World, that kind of.
Cool World.
Yeah, Cool World is
Eek the Cat.
Eek the Cat. License. They would be a place that license games.
So
you know what? They did Shaq Fu.
Really?
They did Shaq Fu. Yeah, and no one can
game
say
I genuinely love.
Yeah, Shaq Fu is fun. Clive Barker's Nightbreed for Amiga. Let's see what else here.
This Power Serve Tennis, I feel like new generations launch with a tennis game because you don't have to render that much, a grass field and then some circles in the background for an audience. Feels like a good way to get your feet wet with like 3D models.
Yeah, we've got the character models and that's like maybe some of the structures and that's it.
And they're I feel like they're generally easy to pick up and play and figure out and have fun with. It's basically just Pong with a different shade, with a different overlay.
Rockstar made a table tennis game, right?
Did they? They might have. Yeah, that sounds right. Rockstar did all kinds of weird stuff that we forget about.
Yes. Rockstar table tennis.
Here's a big one. I would say this is the answer to Mario at the time, and it is Rayman. Rayman is a game that is also on the Saturn. It's also on the Jaguar, also on DOS, but it is a big, beautiful 2D platformer with tons of color, more color than you would ever get to see on something like the Genesis or the Super Nintendo. This game is very fun. Have you guys played the original Rayman?
I have.
You have, Connor? Okay.
This is one of those games I played at that first friend's house, Spice Girl's friend, at his house, and I loved it. I would even go on to. I own a copy of it on the Game Boy Advance. It was also a Game Boy Advance launch window title.
Yeah, and it plays great on there as well. It's kind of a I would describe it as maybe a slower paced 2D platformer. So think something like on the Super Nintendo, you had all kinds of games like this. Like Cool World is a good idea. is it cool? No, Cool Spot. Do you guys remember
Oh, sure.
Oh, yes.
Cool Spot with like the 7-Up logo guy?
It does, as I'm watching some gameplay of it, it feels like, again, a Super Nintendo, like it's doing all of that stuff that Super Mario World 2 was doing with like the pixels or the sprites could like zoom in and out.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like they're like really playing with that in a way that you almost could on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, this is something that they're just like, I'm sure they could have made a demake for the Super Nintendo and had it sell well. But the fact that we get all of this new stuff and just the design of Rayman, his arms are not connected to his body. Like there's like little things going on technically that I think might have been harder to achieve for the Super Nintendo. So
why do you think Rayman doesn't have arms?
I don't know what Rayman is. I don't think I've ever known what Rayman is. He's more nose than man.
Yeah.
I
do feel like it's almost a sin to question Rayman.
Yeah.
He's a being beyond us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he will. Yeah, that's a big mistake. Also, I think you were kind of saying this, McCollor, but like beautiful cartoon animated openings and cutscenes and stuff that are going to appear on this game. That make the experience of playing it just all the more like rich and fun and feel so modern for the time. We also, of course, get Ridge Racer on this. You couldn't sell this thing without Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer is a classic tentpole. Charlie brought this up on the Space Solace, but Street Fighter the movie, the game, which I never realized that it came out on the PlayStation until now. I always thought this was a Saturn game. I remember seeing this in the arcades and then seeing it boxed version of it for the Sega Saturn. I remember that was the reason I wanted the Sega Saturn so bad, is I wanted to play Street Fighter the movie, the game, baby. This is a weird one. Have you guys ever played this?
No, I'm just looking at images of it now.
I do feel like I've watched a lot of it somehow.
Yeah.
It's come across my desk.
It's very weird because it is, again, it's another Mortal Kombat style looking game where the sprites are all sort of weirdly mocapped people, but it plays like the original Street Fighter 2. So like all the combos are the same and still sort of work for each character.
That's so
it reminds me of like, do you know when on Nickelodeon they did like a Fairly Odd Parents Jimmy Neutron crossover? Yeah. It looks like Street Fighter in the Mortal Kombat universe.
Yes,
and it's Uncanny Valley in a way that disgusts me.
It's gross. It's very
hard
gross.
to look at.
It's so funny that I wanted this so bad as a kid. Like the things that you think are cool are just so stupid. Moving on to Raiden. This is a weird series of games. I don't know. Have you guys ever heard of the series Raiden? It's another shoot 'em up, bullet hell style.
No, never.
These are normally top down shooters,
yes.
like sort of Galaga style, and they would end up making many games after this that go back to that version, to that sort of style. But Raiden Project is it definitely has 3D elements to it.
Yeah,
So,
maybe even...
Yeah, I'm looking at it, and I would have guessed this was a Super Nintendo game.
Yeah.
Just from gameplay. I don't know if it does cool effects later, but yeah, it looks good. Big laser.
Yeah, it's very fast, very fun. And then I guess it just features cutscenes that are like.
Yeah, that's what I think a lot of the 3D is.
There we go. Okay.
And
yeah.
perhaps your ship is actually, it doesn't even look 3D modeled. It looks like a sprite with some depth to it, really.
Yeah. It is just a sprite based game. This would have been a kind of a cool thing to pick up day one. I mean, I think I would have like. Well, why don't we at the end go shopping and we'll put on our lists like if we were only allowed 2. This is what we would get. And then lastly, we have a game called Total Eclipse, which is kind of more what I was thinking that Raiden Project game was, which is like a fully 3D shooter plane game, futuristic plane game.
I can't tell if this is like an on-rail shooter, like a Star Fox, or sort of like a open zone area. type of game. It's really hard to tell just from the screenshots, but sorry, I can't say for sure.
Yeah, I got video of it. It looks like PlayStation 1 Star Fox.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it looks like it is on rails, and it does look like a version of Star Fox, but it's weird because it's also kind of doing the Mortal Kombat thing, where all the sprites are these like JPEGs that they've like engineered to make them look like 3D models. The environments are sort of 3D, but this looks like a game that it could potentially be very fun. I'm like really liking the. It looks crazy. It just looks really crazy. I'm really liking how like the shooting looks. It's very colorful. Like you're blasting out like yellow and blues, and
this looks awesome.
It does kind of look awesome.
This game looks awesome.
Yeah. I'm kind of like, and it looks like it plays very fast. Like the frame rate's very good on it too.
Yeah. Oh, and then you get wide open. You go out into the moon.
Yeah, you're doing all kinds of stuff. This is like
I'd buy this game today.
This could be a nice little precursor to Star Fox, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so yeah, let's pretend that we are living in Japan at the time, and let's pick. So mom and dad are giving you your PS1, beautiful PS1. You open it up, you're freaking out. What are the 2 games that you are going home with
from the Japanese lineup?
From the Japanese lineup.
Oh, I think. God, I feel like I have to refresh my memory on all these again. I'll go weird. I'll go weird, and I'll go 2. Did you say 2 games we get?
Yes, 2. You get 2 games. You get a main one and then a bad one.
Okay, I'll go Proteus. I think a shoot 'em up would be fun. And then I'll go the Tama Adventurous Ball and Giddy Labyrinth, because it could be a complete piece of crap. It also could be a fascination.
I love that. Okay, I'm gonna try to be true to who I was at the time, not now. I'm going Ridge Racer because that's nice. I feel like that's the graphics. And I needed graphics back then. And then I think I'm gonna go. I'm gonna pick Crime Crackers.
Sick.
But what's gonna happen there is I'm gonna play it for 10 minutes, realize I don't like Crime Crackers. I'm gonna regret it because I really should have got that beat 'em up game. Neketsu Oyako.
That game.
I think I would have liked that better. But I would pick Crime Crackers. McCollor, what are you getting?
Yeah, I think it's Ridge Racer and Crime Crackers, but Tama Adventure Ball does have this like snipper clips energy to it, whereas like there's such a perfect place in a launch system lineup for a game that is barely a game. I don't know, that feels unfair, but like just a simple little concept that you'll just have some fun with. I also hated racing games as a kid, and maybe I wouldn't. I think I would probably go with, my actual pick is Mahjong Goku Tenjuku and Mahjong Station Mason.
Wow.
Sweet.
You're getting the 2 Mahjong games back to back. I love that. So when you've completely destroyed one Mahjong, you can move on to the next.
How can you truly have an opinion on Mahjong Goku Tenjaku without playing Mahjong Station Mason?
Yeah, of course. And of course, Mason stands for Craig Mason. That was his first jaunt
bringing us back to the
we would eventually call it Cornyn.
Yeah. Okay, now North America, we are up on it. We're rich as hell, and our parents are getting us whatever we want. We're spoiled brats. We get a PlayStation, and we get 2 games. This one's harder for me.
Yeah,
this one's much harder because I'm just interested in it. Does anyone have a take right away? Does anyone have 2 right away? Because I'm still thinking. What's yours?
It's easy for me. I'll go NBA Jam Tournament Edition and Rayman. 2 like known. I know what I'm getting, and I'm gonna like both of them.
I that is maybe closer to what I would pick today.
I'm trying my best to unify my two selves in the same way. Yeah.
I'm not. Here's my thing: is I'm not. I know myself. I'm not getting Rayman, even though I should have gotten Rayman. I'm not. If I'm in 1995, I'm not getting Rayman. McCollor, do you have yours ready?
I think my today is NBA Jam and Rayman. I think my then might have been Street Fighter the movie and Battle Arena Toishiden.
Oh,
I feel like that would have like blown my mind at the time, and I've been like, those are the ones that like really take advantage of the system.
Yeah, I might have done I'm definitely Street Fighter the movie, the game. That is the one I'm getting for sure.
Funny.
That's one I'm getting for sure. And the real answer, if I was going to get a fighting game, I should have got Battle Arena Toshinden. That would have been the more impressive one. But I'm getting Street Fighter the movie, the game, and I think there's a small chance I might have gotten Rayman just so I had the balance. But I'm probably getting Ridge Racer. And Street Fighter the movie, the game. And really today I would have gotten probably Rayman, and I might not have gotten NBA Jam anyway. I might have gotten Rayman and Ridge Racer. Yeah, those are the two I might get
today. I would probably really do Total Eclipse.
Yeah.
Like if I had access to YouTube at the time, I would have watched that game and thought it was cool.
Yeah.
NBA Jam Tournament Edition is just an all-time great. I think I would have absolutely avoided it as a kid because I was like, nah, that's a Super Nintendo game. Yes. But today, NBA Jam is one of the best pick-up and play games I've ever touched.
Right. Yeah, but kind of like not a bad looking launch window for the PS1.
No.
Definitely not as bad as I would have assumed it was. I mean, especially just like trying to get like some numbers like in there. Like there's N64 launches with 2 games.
Yeah, there's decent variety here and a lot of like good stuff. No absolute showstoppers, I would say, but plenty of fascination and plenty of like good bang for your buck.
And like a good amount of, hey, this console will do this better later, but for now we have Battle Arena Toshinden when Tekken 3 is just a year or two out, Well, great. I mean, that's the PlayStation 1 launch in a nutshell. I think we did a very good job covering this moment in time. Yeah, does anyone have anything else they want to throw out there before we get the hell out of here?
No.
Are there any games just that you guys have like stuck in your head as launch titles? Like I would have assumed and think maybe until today, I thought Resident Evil 1 was at least a launch window, but it was maybe a year or two into the system, right?
I think it was 1 year into the North American, because I think it's 96 when it comes out. So it's pretty quick, but it's not right away. Yeah.
I guess just all those long box ones. That is my like collecting white whale. Like someday I will own a long box Resident Evil 1, but
yeah, I think
$150, 200 or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that would be great to own though. I think I would have assumed Tomb Raider was a launch game. I think would have assumed that like Wild Arms, because RPGs were so huge. And Wild Arms is, I think there's a long box version of that first Wild Arms games, and it's basically just a SNES RPG, a top-down sprite-based RPG, but they put it on but it's for the PS1. I would have, and I guess just to that note, I would have assumed there was at least one RPG. Yeah. Even if it was basic and bad,
For a console that is kind of known as like with the Super Nintendo, the two Titan consoles of of RPGs, especially JRPGs, that is so surprising.
Like Lunar. I would have assumed Lunar.
The first Lunar,
or something, yeah. So that's an interesting sort of revelation.
Wow.
Yeah. And then when do you guys think, I mean, I guess it's just kind of just on that same topic. When do you guys think the PlayStation 1 really gets good? I think it's by 97 it's ubiquitous. I think even with Resident Evil, which is a huge game, I think it needs to have like 4 of those in order to become like boom huge.
I was looking up when Tomb Raider 2 came out.
Yeah,
and that in my head is when it kind of like all those games like Tomb Raider 1, Resident Evil 1, like they need some time because they're new and nobody really knows. And it doesn't become like an entertainment force until the sequel when everybody can collectively be like on the Tomb Raider train.
Yeah.
So I would say 97 as well.
Yeah, yeah. Because then you need 97 to get everyone ready and have consoles for 98 when it becomes the checkmate year of Metal Gear and Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy 8 and all these great.
The checkmate year. That's what we refer to it as.
Yeah. It's a great year. I mean, we talk about it all the time, but 98 is that
truly.
one of those great years.
If you could go tell yourself your 98 self one thing, what would you tell him? I'd tell him keep doing what you're doing. Resident Evil 2 is the right way to spend your time right now.
Yeah. I would probably go back in time and be like, you're wasting your time on these games that don't matter. Like these small little Sub-Zero, Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zeros and stuff. Like I'm playing a lot of I'm missing some huge moments by playing dumb stuff. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I do end up playing, of course, Ocarina. I mean, Ocarina is like the thing that I will play, but I miss Metal Gear Solid altogether, and I feel like a huge dope.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I was
huge
missing
fuck up.
stuff like that. I played I don't think I played Ocarina of Time until like early 2000, late 99, when I saw it at a friend's house and just had to have it, and eventually got it because I was ready for Majora, but not Ocarina. So I would probably go back and tell myself to get a job.
Yeah, yeah. Also, 96 is Crash Bandicoot 1, 97 is Crash Bandicoot 2, which also solidifies like the mascot element of Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
This was the
is
first
is
system that
98.
like my brain couldn't comprehend it didn't have a mascot. I think that's why it didn't like enter my field of consciousness until the Crashes and Tomb Raiders were out. I was like, well, who's the face of this?
100%.
Technology?
Yeah, is it Battle Arena Toshinden? And Rayman can't be the face of it. That's another thing. It's because he exists in too many different places.
Yeah.
So
And is missing so many body parts.
yeah.
He's just a face.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
neck.
Okay, let's go ahead and close out. That was the PlayStation launch. We were excited to bring this to you. We'll be bringing more PlayStation 1 related stuff in our PlayStation 30th. But more of that in the future. I've been Jeremy Schmidt. I'm your host for this episode, or one of the hosts for this episode. You can find me on social media at Jeremy Schmidt. You can listen to my show, Video Games, a Comedy Show, anywhere podcasts can be found. Mikey McCollor, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on all the socials at Secret Blimp, youtube.com/@secretblimp for comedy sketches, and twitch.tv/Secret Blimp for, honestly, Resident Evil 2. I'm doing speed runs and I'm doing randomizers. So that's some PlayStation 1 content, sort of.
Yes. And Conner McCabe.
Yeah, thanks for listening. This has been a blast. You can follow me on social media at Conner McCabe on Blue Sky, at Conner underscape McCabe on Instagram, and on Twitch at twitch.tv/ConsIsCool69, where I stream video games that I'm playing, including the Control, which is the game we're playing for our current games club, and some other stuff as well. The PlayStation 1 library shuffles will be there. Yeah, check out my podcast, Call Me By Your Game, if you don't know it already. You probably do if you're listening on this network. And for the network as well, follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram. If you're listening to this on Patreon and you're not in the Discord, message us. We'll send you a fresh link so you can hop in there. And just as a reminder, these episodes moving forward, the next 5 are going to be on the Engineer Toad tier, which has more than that, just as the benefits. So if you want to hear those as they come out, subscribe at that tier. And if you, but they will be available at the very end of the year for everyone on our Patreon. So if you want them early, that costs you a little extra. And if not, it's going to come to you eventually. So yeah, Jeremy, I guess I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back a little bit later on with something else. Bye-bye.